The roar of bulldozers ripped through the dawn, their steel blades grinding into the walls of my cabin, tearing apart the last promise I made to my dying wife. Dust filled the air like smoke from a battlefield, and as I stood helpless on the porch, I wondered if this was how our love story ended: splintered wood, shattered glass, and silence. But just as Margaret Vane, the almighty HOA president, smirked from behind her white Escalade federal agents stepped from the shadows, weapons drawn, and the game shifted. My name is Elijah Ward. I'm 62 years old, and for 30 years I was a federal prosecutor. They used to call me the Mafia Killer because I put away more crooked politicians and corrupt officials than anyone in Colorado history. Cancer forced me to retire, but it also gave me time to build the mountain cabin my wife Emily had designed during her final months alive. She drew every line on the blueprints herself, hands trembling from chemo, whispering to me, "Promise you'll build it exactly like this, Elijah." It's our legacy. 3 years later, I'd finally kept that promise. The cabin sat just beyond the boundaries of Evergreen Peaks, a gated mountain community run by an HOA. I'd chosen the ridge carefully, high enough, isolated enough outside their legal reach, or so I thought. Then Margaret Vane arrived. 57, slick, blonde hair, designer glasses hiding eyes like shark teeth. She showed up in a spotless Escalade flanked by 2 men in cheap suits waving a thick folder of official-looking papers. "Mr. Ward," she announced, stepping out like a queen addressing her peasant. "I'm Margaret Vane, president of the Evergreen Peaks Homeowners Association. You owe $5,700 in overdue snow removal fees, and if you don't pay within 30 days, we'll pursue asset forfeiture." I leaned on the railing, coughing like the frail old retiree she assumed I was. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, ma'am. My cabin isn't part of your HOA." Her smile sharpened. She shoved the folder into my hands. The documents were convincing legal jargon county seals maps, but to my trained eyes they were garbage. 7 major legal violations before I even finished the first paragraph. I pretended confusion, recording every word on my phone. "What happens if I can't pay?" I asked, voice trembling. "Then we'll seize your property through the courts," she replied smoothly. I smiled weakly, thanked her for the visit, and watched her Escalade disappear down the mountain road. The second she was gone, I dropped the act, grabbed my real phone, and called my daughter Naomi. She's 30, an award-winning investigative journalist. "Dad," she said, hearing my tone, "what's wrong?" "Sweetheart, I told her I might need you to go undercover." Next call went to my neighbor Daniel Crow Walker, a Lakota craftsman whose family lived here for 6 generations before HOAs even existed. He'd seen Margaret leave. She pulled the same scam on my cousin Thomas, Daniel said. Tried to call our sweat lodge a non-conforming structure. That night, spreading Margaret's fake documents across Emily's drafting table, I felt the old prosecutor's instincts come alive. This wasn't about HOA fees. It was a land grab. Red X's marked properties owned by the elderly and minorities' families least able to fight back. And Margaret was the front woman. Naomi built a fake identity, Nicole Winters, slipping easily into Margaret's orbit as her new assistant. She played the role perfectly clumsy, naive, desperate to please. Within days, she had access to Margaret's files, and what she uncovered turned my stomach. Margaret wasn't just extorting homeowners. She was buying their land dirt cheap, then flipping it to Blackstone Mining Corporation for 10 times the price. Blackstone wasn't after scenic cabins, they were after rare earth minerals buried beneath the Rockies. Minerals worth billions. Margaret was the smiling predator clearing the path. The pressure escalated fast. Margaret called a community meeting at the high school gym, 200 residents packed into bleachers. She plastered photos of my cabin on a screen accusing me of fire hazards, erosion, illegal construction. Her tone was icy righteous. And then, like a magician pulling a rabbit, she introduced Judge Harrison Blake, a district judge, her secret weapon. His presence alone swayed the crowd. When she finally asked if I'd like to respond, I stood slowly, playing the part of the weary old man before dropping the hammer, Mrs. Vane. I said, mispronouncing her name just enough to sting. Could you cite which Colorado statute allows HOAs to collect fees from properties outside their legal boundaries? Her smile cracked. I pulled out my folder, Actual County Records Property Law Statutes and Corporation Maps. Because according to state law, your HOA authority stops below 8,500 feet. My cabin sits at 8,742. The room murmured. Some nodded. Others frowned. Margaret's voice climbed an octave, grasping at community responsibility and safety of children. The judge chimed in a shameless show of backing. Fear shifted the tide back in her favor. I walked out with half the room convinced, the other half whispering thanks. That night, Daniel waited by my truck. His face was pale. They hit Thomas. 3 men with bats. Told him to tell the old lawyer he's got 48 hours to leave the mountain. I drove home shaking. My neighbor lay in a hospital bed with broken ribs because of me. For the first time, I thought maybe Margaret had won. Maybe I was just a stubborn old man risking lives for a cabin that should have stayed a dream. I sat at Emily's desk holding her final journal. Promise me you'll protect this house, she'd written. Not just from weather, but from people who would destroy beautiful things for ugly reasons. I nearly gave up that night. Nearly. But Naomi called voice urgent. Dad, Margaret's tied to Congressman Walsh, $500,000 in donations from Blackstone. And she's terrified of someone named Victor Clove. This isn't just local, it's organized crime. Then Daniel told me something that changed everything. Emily, before she died, had sought permission from the Lakota Council to build on sacred ground. She'd honored their traditions, respected the land, documented every step. That documentation had triggered a federal heritage review still pending. If the cabin was recognized, destroying it would be a federal crime. The plan became clear bait Margaret into overstepping. Let her commit the crime on record. Naomi kept feeding me intel. Margaret had a contract with Blackstone. If she didn't deliver the land within 60 days, she'd lose a $10 million bonus. She was desperate enough to risk everything. So I played my part. I called her voice weary. Mrs. Vane, I said I can't afford the fees. Maybe selling the cabin would be best. Her triumph oozed through the line. Mr. Ward, that's a wise choice, but time is short. You must decide immediately. I stalled, knowing she'd crack under the pressure. And she did. She hired Anderson Demolition for a 5 a.m. job, triple-pay judge's paperwork ready to back her. Naomi warned me Dad tomorrow morning is it. She's moving in for the kill. So I prepared. Secured Emily's drawings. Alerted Rebecca Torres at the FBI. Undercover agents slipped into the demolition crew. Daniel's people watched from the ridge. And at dawn, headlights snaked up the mountain road. 2 bulldozers, 12 men. Margaret's Escalade gleaming like a throne. She stood proud, clipboard in hand, ordering her men to tear down the cabin before inspectors arrived. The engines roared, blades lowered, earth-shaking as they crawled toward the walls Emily designed. My heart pounded, but I felt no fear, only cold prosecutorial patience. "Margaret," I shouted over the noise. "Are you certain you want to destroy federally protected sacred ground?" Her face froze. "What are you talking about?" I held up the official certificate. Heritage protection signed, sealed, dated last week. 20 years in prison for anyone who laid a hand on it. The bulldozer stopped inches from the wall. Margaret's phone flew to her ear. She was panicking now. That's when Naomi stepped out from behind the Escalade, ripping off her wig. Camera in hand. "Actually, Margaret," she said, voice clear and sharp, "he's telling the truth. I'm Naomi Ward, CBS News, and I've been recording everything." Margaret's face drained white. She shrieked about Clove, about death threats, about forces bigger than us. And that's when 4 demolition workers straightened, tore off their helmets, and flashed FBI badges. "Margaret Vane, Agent Torres declared you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, mail fraud, and destruction of federal property." Handcuffs snapped shut. Her empire collapsed with a metallic click. As they dragged her away, Torres's phone buzzed. She smiled. "Judge Blake has just been arrested. Every fraudulent order he signed is evidence now." I stood on my porch, Emily's wooden box in my hands, watching the bulldozers idle silent. Margaret screamed about Clove, about operations in 47 states, about billions at stake. But none of it mattered anymore. Her reign ended there in front of Cameron's neighbors and the spirits Emily had wanted to honor. The mountain air felt lighter. My cabin still stood. And for the first time in months, I breathed without fear. Sometimes the law moves slowly. Sometimes it feels powerless. But when justice finally lands, it crushes greed like stone.